You can't deny China's economic power. But look, this isn't just a story about numbers on a chart. It's about maybe the most dramatic and fastest societal transformation in all of modern history. So in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how they did it.
And this right here, this is the big question, isn't it? I mean, think about it. Just a few decades back, China was one of the poorest nations on Earth, dealing with famine and constant instability. So how in the world did it go from having more than 90% of its people in extreme poverty to the economic beast we see today? What was the secret sauce?
Okay, just take a look at these numbers for a second. They're staggering. Back in 1978, China's economy was, let's be honest, barely a blip on the world's radar, just 2% of global GDP. Today, it's a whopping 18%. This chart tells you what happened. For the rest of this, we're going to dig into the how. All right, first up, a century of struggle. See, to really get China's explosive rise, you have to start with its devastating fall. Because the seeds of its modern economic miracle were actually planted in a long, painful time of chaos and weakness. So for about 100 years, from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, China went through what they now call the century of humiliation. It was just one disaster after another. You had foreign powers carving up the country, starting with the Opium Wars. You had brutal internal conflicts like the Taiping Rebellion, a crushing defeat by Japan, and then the horrific invasion by Japan during World War II. By the end of it, the country was just shattered and broke. Okay, so that brings us to our next chapter, the Great Leap Sideways. After all that humiliation, the new People's Republic, led by Mao Zedong, was dead set on making China a world power again. His plan was to totally re-engineer society from the top down, with a series of really radical and ambitious campaigns.
And the crown jewel of his plan was something called the Great Leap Forward. The goal was, well, it was nuts, really, to basically skip decades of slow development and turn China into an industrial heavyweight almost overnight. The whole thing rested on two big ideas: collectivizing all the farms and kicking off a massive grassroots industrial boom.
So how did that work out in the real world? Well, on the farms, private land, gone. Farmers were herded into these giant government communes, which completely killed any motivation to actually grow food. Meanwhile, everywhere else, people were told to build these little backyard steel furnaces to make steel. The problem? The steel they made was totally useless, and while they were busy making bad steel, they weren't farming. Grain production just tanked by 15%.
And the result of all this was an absolute catastrophe. These policies led directly to the Great Chinese Famine, one of the worst in all of human history. We're talking about a death toll that could be as high as 50 million people. It's just a mind-boggling human cost for a failed economic experiment.
But, this story isn't quite that simple. It wasn't all a disaster. Believe it or not, during this same chaotic period, Mao's government did make some huge leaps forward in things like education, literacy rates shot up, and new laws gave women way more rights than they ever had before. So these social changes actually built a stronger foundation that would, believe it or not, help fuel the growth that came later. All right, next up, Deng's revolution. So after Mao died in '76, China was at a huge turning point, and the guy who stepped up, Deng Xiaoping, had a completely different playbook. He'd actually been punished for criticizing Mao's policies, so he was more than ready to steer the ship in a totally new direction. He became the architect of the China we know today. This slide just lays out the shift so perfectly. Mao was all about top-down control and being a pure communist. Deng? He basically tossed that idea in the trash. His philosophy was simple: be practical. He famously said he didn't care if a cat was black or white as long as it catches mice. His new model was called socialism with Chinese characteristics, which was really code for, if it makes money and gets results, let's do it. And his whole approach can be summed up in this one brilliant quote. It means there was no grand master plan. Deng's method was to move forward slowly, carefully, one step at a time. You test something out on a small scale, see if it works, if the stone is solid, and then you take the next step. So what was that first stone in the river? It was farming. Deng got rid of the communes and brought in the household responsibility system. The idea was genius in its simplicity. The government leased land back to families. They had to hand over a chunk of their crops to the state, but anything extra, they could sell it on the open market and pocket the cash. For the first time in a long time, there was a reason to work hard, profit.
And of course, Deng didn't stop with the farms. He took that same exact logic and applied it to the factories. Basically, he fired the party officials who didn't know anything about business and put the actual factory managers in charge.
They got the freedom to decide what to make, what to charge, and how to run their business. All of a sudden, people had a sense of ownership, and they were motivated.
And the momentum just kept building. He encouraged these things called township and village enterprises, which brought industry to the countryside. And then came the real game changer, special economic zones. Think of them as little capitalist laboratories with low taxes and fewer rules, designed to lure in foreign companies. It was all part of his open door policy, a massive signal to the world that China was, finally, open for business.
But look, an economy like this needs smart people to run it, right? It needs fuel, and that fuel was human capital. Deng's government got this, and they invested big time. They made 9 years of school mandatory, they poured money into education with a focus on science, tech, and job skills, and they started pumping billions into R&D. They were building the workforce they needed for a modern economy.
So, did it all work? Well, the results are, honestly, they're hard to even comprehend. But, and this is a big but, this economic miracle came with a very steep price.
And nothing shows the sheer scale of this success better than comparing China to India. Look at 1990. They were pretty much neck and neck. India was even a little bit ahead. Now, fast forward 30 years, it's not even a contest. China's economy per person absolutely skyrocketed, leaving India's in the dust. It just shows how potent their unique strategy was. Remember that open door policy? Well, the door didn't just open, it was blown off its hinges by a flood of foreign money. In 1980, foreign investment was basically zero. By 2021, it was over $333 billion. That cash, combined with China's massive workforce, is what turned it into the world's factory.
And this right here brings us all the way back to that first question we asked. The end result of this 40-year revolution was the single largest and fastest reduction in poverty in the history of the world. Period. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted into the middle class. It's an absolutely incredible achievement.
But that leads to the critical question. Okay, so economic freedom was a massive success. But what about political freedom? Did that follow? This is where the story takes a much darker turn.
And the answer, in no uncertain terms, was no. Deng's deal with the Chinese people was pretty clear. You can get rich, but you cannot challenge the Communist Party's power. The economy opened up, but the political system remained a closed authoritarian state. And if anyone had any doubts about that, the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989 crushed them. It was a brutal message that showed exactly where the line was. The hope that capitalism would automatically lead to democracy, well, in China, that just didn't happen. So in the end, we're left with this really complicated picture. On one hand, you have an economic miracle that improved more lives more quickly than anything we've ever seen. But on the other hand, you have a system that did it all while tightening its authoritarian grip. It's a staggering success story that forces us all to ask a really tough question. What was the true cost?